On a frosty December morning in Munich, a 7-year-old boy says something that will change his family forever. The star was not a star, it spoke, and I followed its voice. It was one of those crisp, clear December mornings in Munich when the sun hung like a pale coin over the rooftops. The heating hummed softly as Helena sliced the bread and Marcus skimmed the newspaper. Only Elias was silent. The 7-year-old stared at the steam rising from his cocoa, as if he saw something in it that the others didn't. "You are so quiet today," said Helena, a smile in her tone, routine in her movement. Elias raised his gaze, and in his eyes lay a strange calm, unbecoming of a child. Then he spoke, without pathos, without hesitation. "The star was not a star. It spoke, and I followed its voice." Helena froze, the knife in her hand. Marcus slowly lowered the newspaper. For a moment, the only sound was the ticking of the wall clock. "Which star, my darling?" the mother finally asked, trying to sound light-hearted. Elias answered with a composure that made the room shiver. "The one who came down and led the men out of the desert." Marcus cleared his throat. "Do you mean the Christmas star? From the 3 wise men?" "He wasn't a shooting star," Elias replied. "He was a voice of light. I heard it. It guided us." It silenced both parents. Helena forced a smile. "You mean you dreamt about it, right?" But Elias just slowly shook his head. "No, Mom, I was there." Marcus, who always believed in reason, tried to smile, but his fingers trembled slightly as he folded the newspaper. "Perhaps you heard about this in religious studies class, about the wise men?" "We don't talk about stars at school, Dad," said the boy. "Only about planets. But they're silent." Helena felt her heart beat faster. This wasn't a fantasy, not a fairy tale. It sounded like a memory. "And what did the star say?" she asked softly. Elias looked out, where the faint winter light fell through the window. "He said that we must leave while our hearts are still warm, because when it gets cold, you can no longer see the light." A shiver ran down Helena's spine. She looked for her husband's gaze, but Marcus stared at his son as if he saw him speaking a foreign language. "Maybe he picked it up somewhere," Helena whispered, more to herself. "Or he's playing," replied Marcus, but his voice sounded shaky. Elias took a sip of cocoa as if the conversation were long over. Then he said softly, almost dreamily, "The voice was not in heaven. It was within us. It walked with us through the sand until we found the place where the child was waiting." Nobody said anything. The steam above the cup dissipated, and with it, the normality of this morning. Marcus finally placed his hand firmly on the table, as if he needed to anchor himself. "Elias, how do you know all this?" The boy shrugged almost imperceptibly. "Because I saw it. Dad, I was the youngest. The star spoke to me first." Then he took the last piece of bread as if nothing had happened. Helena felt tears welling up in her eyes without knowing why. And Marcus, the man of facts, looked out the window, searching the sky for something he didn't think he could find. After Elias's sentence, a strange silence descended upon the kitchen. Dense, almost physical. Only the soft clinking of spoons against cups served as a reminder that the world still turned. Marcus mechanically flipped through the newspaper without reading a single line. Helena looked at her son as if trying to find a trace of imagination between his words, but there was none. Only this quiet, childlike certainty. "Elias," began Marcus, trying to sound calm, "you know that stars are made of gas, right? Balls of fire, far away." The boy nodded. "Yes, Dad, but the one I mean wasn't up there. He was with us. He left." "Was it possible?" Marcus laughed briefly, nervously. "Stars don't work. This one did," Elias interrupted calmly. "He spoke, not with words, but internally, like music without sound." Helena placed her hand on his shoulder. "And what did he say?" Elias answered without hesitation. "He has called us. We should follow, through the sand, to the west." She felt her stomach clench. "Us?" "Yes, Mama. I wasn't alone. There were 2 others. One wore a long robe, and the other carried a bowl filled with fragrance. We saw the light and knew where it led. Marcus made a sound, half laughter, half sigh. That's a story from the Bible. 3 wise men from the east. Surely you've heard it and... No, Elias said firmly. I remember. The sand was hot, the night was blue, and when we arrived, the boy knew who we were. Helena stood up as if she needed to catch her breath. She went to the window. Outside, snow glittered on the bare branches, peaceful, still. Everything seemed so normal, and that's precisely what made the situation so eerie. Marcus followed her gaze, then cleared his throat. Let's not read too much into it. It's just a child's fantasy, nothing more. But Helena heard the doubt in his voice. Children repeat what they hear, he continued, this time louder. He may have seen something, a picture, a song, nothing more. But Elias looked at him, seriously, intently. I didn't see anything, Dad. I didn't see it, lived. The words echoed as if they had opened an invisible window. Helena returned to the table, forcing a smile. My darling, you know, sometimes you dream things that feel real. Maybe that's what happened. Elias was silent. Then he whispered, as if speaking to someone only he could hear. The lights never sleep, only people forget. Marcus stood up. Enough now. That's enough. We'll talk again later. He grabbed his bag, gave Elias a quick kiss on the head, and headed for the door. But just before he stepped out, he turned around and saw the boy staring back at his hot chocolate, as if following something invisible. Helena stayed behind. She sat down, her head in her hands. Elias looked at her gently, almost consolingly. Don't be afraid, Mom. The light won't hurt anyone. She smiled weakly. I'm not afraid, darling. But she knew that was a lie. Later that day, as Marcus sat in his car on the way to university, he briefly saw the sky over Munich in his rearview mirror, a cloud shaped like an 8-pointed flame. Coincidence, he thought. Nothing more. But something inside him knew. The silence at the breakfast table was only the beginning. In the days following the strange breakfast, something changed in the Vogler family home. Not immediately, more like a quiet hum, only noticeable when the silence becomes too loud. Elias was the same boy as always, friendly, quiet, attentive. But at night, something began to happen. It was 3 o'clock in the morning when Helena first awoke with a start. A sound, barely more than a whisper, came from her son's room. She walked quietly down the hall, opened the door a crack, and stopped. Elias was sitting upright in bed, his face illuminated by the moonlight, his eyes open but absent. Elias, she whispered. No reaction. Then she heard it. Words. Incomprehensible. Strange. Orion. Shemesh. Bara. 3 names that sounded like prayers. The next morning, she cautiously asked him if he had had a bad dream. Elias shook his head. No, I saw them. The lights. They were back. Which lights? They come from the sky. They call softly so that no one is frightened. He took a sheet of paper and began to draw, not just any star, but a shape made of light, 8 points, and from the center a spiral line radiating outwards, twisting like a living tail. It moves like this, he explained. Not in a straight line, but like breathing. Helena picked up the sheet of paper and felt her pulse quicken. It wasn't typical childish scribbling. The lines were precise, almost geometric, as if following a logic she didn't understand. That evening, she showed Marcus the drawing. He saw it somewhere, he said. On television, maybe a Christmas movie. No, Helena said quietly. He knew words I had never heard before. Marcus smiled wryly. Children have imagination. Let's not make a mystery out of it. But 2 nights later, it happened again. This time, Elias cried out in his sleep. She's back. She's here again. Helena ran into his room. He stood at the window, barefoot, his forehead pressed against the glass. Outside, the sky was clear, winter cold. Do you see her, Mom? When? The one who speaks. The one from the sand. She is now above Munich. Helena cautiously approached, following his gaze. Nothing. Only stars. Languid, distant. "There's nothing there, darling." "Yes," Elias said quietly. "She's hiding because people don't listen." He turned around, lay down again, closed his eyes, as if everything was over. The next morning, Helena found another sheet of paper on his bedside table. It again had the spiral print. This time he had written something underneath it. "When hearts sleep, the light becomes lonely." She showed it to Marcus, but he waved it off. He's just sensitive. Maybe too many stories. But Marcus lay awake that night. The words echoed in his mind. And when he finally turned over, he saw a faint shimmer in the sky through the window, so brief that he almost thought he had imagined it. Helena stood a little later in the doorway of Elias's room. The boy slept peacefully, his face half lit by the moon. His lips moved slightly, as if he were still speaking, in a language that wasn't from here. She listened until a tear ran down her cheek, because deep down she knew the dream didn't belong to him alone. A week had passed since Elias had started talking in his sleep. Helena tried to keep life normal, school, breakfast, homework, but something about her son had changed. Not sick, not sad, just older, in an inexplicable way. One Wednesday, she took him to his primary school in Schwabing as usual. The teacher, Miss Auer, greeted the children with a warm smile. Nothing hinted at the unusual events that were about to unfold. In the afternoon, when Helena picked up Elias, Mrs. Auer called her aside. "Mrs. Vogler, may I speak with you briefly?" Her tone was friendly, but there was uncertainty in her eyes. In the teacher's room, she showed Helena a stack of drawings, scenes from another world, 3 men on camels, following a light that was not the sun. The glow had human features, like a figure made of pure flame. "Elias painted this today," said Mrs. Auer, "and when I asked him who it was, he said—" She turned to the top sheet, on which Elias had written in childlike handwriting, "I was the youngest. Heaven saw me first." Helena felt her throat go dry. He said that." Mrs. Auer nodded. He spoke calmly, not like when he was playing, almost as if he were remembering. At home, Helena asked the question she had been wanting to ask for days. "Elias, why are you painting these men?" He put the colored pencils aside and looked at them. "Because they were my brothers." "Your brothers?" "Yes, we followed the voice. I was scared, but it said I would see the light first." Helena swallowed. "Did you dream that?" "No, Mom. I remember. I was there. The air smelled of spices, and the ground was hot. We saw the sky burning, and then there was the boy. The one the voice had been waiting for." She felt her heart racing. Marcus would have to hear this, but she already knew what he would say. That evening, Elias placed a new notebook on the table. "What is that?" asked Marcus. "My book of lights," the boy replied. The pages were full of symbols, circles, stars, and intersecting lines like old maps. Between the drawings were sentences written in Elias's childlike handwriting. "Light knows no direction. Those who follow will find themselves. Heaven speaks only when you are silent." Marcus flipped through the pages, his brow furrowed. "Where did you get that?" "I just know it." "That's not possible. You can't know such words." Elias looked at him for a long time, then whispered, "I remember, Dad, not with my head, but with the light." Helena held her breath. There was something in the air that neither of them could explain, a calmness that weighed more heavily than fear. Later that night, she opened the notebook again. One page was colored in with a gold-yellow pen. In the middle it said, "If you ask where I come from, look into the darkness. That is where the light begins." Helena closed the book and held it tightly to herself, as if she could protect her child with it. But she knew this was no longer a game. Helena couldn't sleep anymore. Every night she heard Elias's voice in her head, those quiet, ancient words no child should know. Marcus tried to reassure her, but doubt had grown in his eyes as well. When Elias began murmuring a short prayer in that foreign language before falling asleep, They decided to seek professional help. "We'll talk to Father Benedict," Marcus said firmly one evening. "He's knowledgeable about symbolism. Maybe he can explain to us what's going on in Elijah's head." Helena nodded, but deep down, she was hoping less for an explanation than for comfort. On Sunday afternoon, they entered the small church of St. Corbinian. The winter light filtered through the stained glass windows, making the dusty air shimmer with gold. Elias walked silently between the pews, his hands in his pockets, as if remembering every stone. Father Benedict, a man with a calm voice and a gaze that saw more than it showed, greeted them warmly. "Helena, Marcus, and you must be Elias." The boy nodded and sat down without being asked. Marcus began to speak, matter-of-factly, almost apologetically. He told of the drawings, the words spoken in the night, the dreams. The pastor listened patiently without interrupting. Then Elias turned to him, and suddenly the room was silent. "They want to know why I know the star." Benedict raised his eyebrows slightly. "Yes, Elias, if you like, you can tell me about it." "He wasn't a body in heaven," the boy said. "He was a spirit who guided. We called him Voice of the Most High. He spoke in light, not in sound." Helena saw the priest flinch slightly. "And how do you know that, my child?" "Because I was there, in the sand. I was the youngest. We followed the voice until the light stopped. Then we knew. This is where the path ends." Marcus cleared his throat, but Elias continued speaking, undeterred. "She moved where the wind blew, and if someone doubted, she grew darker. Only those who believed could see her." A long pause. Then Father Benedict said quietly, "And the boy you found?" Elias lowered his gaze. "He knew we were coming. He knew our names. He said, 'The lights have brought you.'" Helena felt her throat tighten. The priest audibly exhaled and clasped his hands together. "Elias," he began cautiously, "some memories don't come from this life. They are echoes. Perhaps something old is calling to you, something that has traveled through time." Elias nodded as if he understood every word. The voice said it would return when people were blind again. Tears streamed down Helena's face. The priest remained silent for a long time, then gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "He carries something within him that cannot be grasped with reason. Perhaps it is not a burden, but a message." Marcus pressed his lips together. "With all due respect, your reverence, I don't believe in—" "Me neither, Marcus," Benedict interrupted calmly. "But sometimes something believes in us, whether we want it to or not." As they left the church, there was snow in the air. Elias turned around one last time and said softly, "She was here, just for a moment." "Who, Elias?" asked Helena. "The voice. It was checking to see if we were listening." And then he smiled, a peaceful, almost knowing smile that shook Helena more than any sermon. Since the conversation with Father Benedict, the house had grown quieter, not out of peace, but out of fear. Marcus hardly spoke about Elijah's stories anymore, as if words could conjure up the incomprehensible once more. Helena, on the other hand, began to observe every little sign, a glance, a sentence, a dream. It was a Saturday evening, just before Christmas. Snow was falling outside, and the house smelled of cinnamon and tea. They were sitting at dinner when Elias suddenly dropped his fork. "They called her the wrong name," he said. "Who do you mean?" asked Helena. "The kings," Elias replied calmly. "They were not kings. They were seekers, travelers of the light." Marcus raised his eyebrows. "You mean the three wise men, Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar?" "That's what they're called now," said the boy. "But back then they had different names. The oldest was called Asher, the middle one was Melon, and I was the youngest. They told me to listen because the light spoke to me first." Marcus put down his cutlery. "Elias, listen, those are stories, old legends. They are not true." Elias looked directly at him, not defiantly, but sadly. "Yes, Papa, I remember his voice, and the smell of the myrrh oil. I wore it. My hands were warm from it. Helena felt her throat go dry. Marcus tried to smile, but his voice trembled. "And what was in the star, Elias?" The boy looked upwards, as if listening to a distant memory. A face, not a person. It was made of fire and light, white as the sun, but soft as breath. It knew us. It knew what the boy would say before he spoke. Marcus reached for his notebook. He had begun to write everything down, rationally, methodically, like a researcher. "Can you tell me when that was?" he asked. "How old were you?" Elias thought about it. "Old enough to understand, too young to doubt." He smiled, a gentle, almost sad smile. Then he turned back to his plate, as if everything had been said. But Helena sensed that he was distancing himself inwardly, like someone caught between two worlds. Later, when Elias was in bed, Marcus leafed through his notebook. Among dates and quotes, he wrote a sentence, without quite knowing why: "When logic ends, memory begins." Helena went to him at the window. Outside, the garden lay still in the snow. "He really believes it, Marcus. Look at him. It's not a fantasy." "Belief is the problem," he murmured. "It replaces experience with memory. But where do these details come from? These names?" "Perhaps," Helena said hesitantly, "perhaps they won't come from him, but through him." Marcus looked at her as if she had just said something dangerous. At that moment, they heard footsteps. Elias stood in the doorway, half asleep, his face pale. "Dad, don't write about it anymore," he said quietly. "You mustn't measure light." Then he turned around and went back to his room. Marcus stood motionless, pen in hand, and felt for the first time that his own knowledge could no longer protect him. Helena placed a hand on his shoulder and whispered, "Perhaps what we called king was just a seeker, like us." Outside, snow fell onto the asphalt, and somewhere in the distance, she thought, a faint, pulsating light glimmered for a breath above the rooftops of Munich. The days until the winter solstice dragged on like cold air. Marcus hardly spoke anymore. Helena moved through the house as if listening for something no one else could hear. Only Elias remained calm, silent, attentive, with that look that sometimes seemed to see two worlds at once. On the evening of December 21st, when shortly before midnight, Helena woke up. A flickering had awakened her, a pulsating bluish light shimmering through the window. At first, she thought it was a car on the street, but the light remained. She quietly got up, crept down the hallway, and opened Elias's door. The boy stood by the window, barefoot, his forehead pressed against the glass. His face was peaceful, almost radiant. "Elias, what are you doing?" He turned to her, and something was reflected in his eyes that she could not see. "She's here, Mom." "Who?" "The voice. The one that shines." Helena went to the window. Outside, a faint glimmer hung above the snow-covered rooftops of Munich. Not a lamp, not a plane, not a star. A round, vibrating light that flickered slowly and then stood still. "Do you see her?" whispered Elias. Helena nodded hesitantly. "Yes, I think so." "She comes when someone remembers," the boy said, only briefly, so that the heart doesn't forget what it knew. Suddenly they heard footsteps. Marcus. He came into the room, still half asleep, but when he saw the light, all tiredness vanished from his face. "What the? That's an airplane, or a reflection," he muttered, reaching for his phone. He held the camera to the window and pressed the shutter. Only a glaring, shapeless white appeared on the display. No contours, no star. "Damn," he whispered, "the exposure." Elias looked at him calmly. "You can't take them in, Dad. You can only feel them." The light began to move, slowly, spirally, almost dancing. Then, after a few seconds, it dissolved, as if it had been sucked into the darkness. Helena stood motionless, tears streaming down her cheeks. Marcus lowered his phone as if he knew that any picture would come too late. Elias whispered, "She saw us. That's enough." No one slept that night. Marcus sat silently at the kitchen table, his phone in front of him. He played the short video over and over again. Just a white flash. No movement. No proof. That was nothing, he finally said, but his voice sounded empty. Helena remained silent. She knew that words explained nothing. The next morning, Elias recounted everything as if it were perfectly normal. She said she would come back when the heart of the world is cold. "What does that mean?" asked Helena. "That she hasn't forgotten us?" Later that day, news reports from Munich indicated isolated sightings of unusual lights in the sky. No one could explain what they were. Some said drones, others plasma, but the images showed only gray patches, barely discernible. Marcus looked at the reports, but he remained silent. He had seen what could not be contained within a measuring instrument. Elias played in the garden, trudged through the snow, and kept looking up. "She sees us, Mom," he said cheerfully, "even when the sky seems empty." And Helena, who had realized that night that some truths need no proof, simply nodded. The light was gone, but its echo remained, in a boy who remembered what the world had forgotten. 2 days after the night of lights, Helena took Elias to school as usual. The snow crunched under her feet, and a strange peace hung in the clear air. Elias seemed calm, almost too calm, as if something inside him had finally settled. But Helena knew. After nights like these, a new wave always came. In the afternoon, when she came to pick him up, Mrs. Auer was waiting in front of the door with a piece of paper in her hand. Her face was pale, a mixture of curiosity and worry. "Mrs. Vogler," she began, "Elias wrote something today. At first I thought it was a game, but then I took a closer look." She handed Helena the sheet. In Elias's childlike handwriting it said, "The light descends in spirals when the hearts are ready." Among them were rows of symbols that looked like a mixture of Hebrew and something unknown. Small circles, hooks, arcs, connected in flowing lines. "I tried to ask him what that meant," said Mrs. Auer. "He just said that they were the names of the paths. I didn't know what to do." Helena picked up the paper, her gaze lingering on the symbols. It was too precise, too rhythmic to be mere scribbling. Thank you," she managed. "I will take care of it." At home, she placed the sheet of paper on the kitchen table. Marcus, who had just come home from work, joined her. "What is that?" "Elias wrote it at school." He picked it up and frowned. "These aren't letters. Maybe some kind of fantasy script." "I don't know," Helena murmured. "Look at the repetitions. There's structure, recurring patterns. He couldn't have invented that." Marcus sighed and reached for his phone. "I know someone at the university, in the Institute for Semitic Studies. I can send him a photo." The next day, Professor Reuter, a linguist and expert in ancient languages, contacted me. His voice on the phone was cautious, almost reverential. "Mr. Vogler, that's strange. The characters strongly resemble an old Aramaic script, but with variations we're not familiar with. However, one of the lines can be read. And what does it say there? Orak Dabara, literally translated, Path of the Sun." Marcus' hand tightened around the phone. "And how could a child know something like that?" "I'm wondering that myself," Reuter replied quietly. "I'd like to see more, perhaps other texts." Helena stood beside him, listening to every word. Elias played on the carpet, humming softly to himself. When Marcus ended the conversation, he looked at his son. "Elias, who showed you these signs?" "No one," he said gently. "I saw her when the light spoke." "When?" "As we followed the star. They stood in the sky, among the sparks. We knew they meant, the way is open." Marcus sat down heavily on the chair. For a moment he couldn't speak. Helena knelt down beside Elijah. "Do you know what Path of the Sun means?" Elias nodded slowly. "It's the path you only find once, and never lose again." Helena closed her eyes. She sensed that something great and unfathomable was approaching, something that was no longer just a memory. And outside, above the rooftops of Munich, a barely visible shimmer glimmered for a few seconds, like a spiral of light that no one noticed except a child who whispered softly, "She is still here." After Christmas, The atmosphere in the Vogler house changed again, this time subtly, but noticeably. It was as if the sky itself had fallen silent. No more whispers in the night, no new drawings. Elias hardly spoke about the light anymore. Instead, he played with his wooden figures again, as if everything had been forgotten. But Helena knew nothing was forgotten. It was just silent. She watched him as he sat by the window, gazing at the gray winter sky and breathing against the glass. "Elias," she asked cautiously one afternoon, "aren't you going to paint anything today?" He shook his head. "No, Mom." "Why not? You liked your stars so much." "She's gone," he said simply. "Gone?" "Yes. The voice, the light, it's gone." Helena sat down next to him. "Where to?" Elias looked out, as if searching for the horizon. "She said she'll come back when the world gets dark again." His words affected her more deeply than she wanted. Something about his voice, that calmness, that certainty, didn't sound like a child's. "What does that mean, Elias?" He looked at her, seriously. "When people forget the light, the earth becomes cold. Then it returns." Helena hugged him tightly, but he remained silent. No trembling, no fear, just this strange, unshakable serenity. When Marcus came home in the evening, she told him about the conversation. "He says the light is gone," she whispered. Marcus put down his bag and massaged his temples. "Maybe this is a good thing. Maybe things will return to normal now." Normality. She smiled bitterly. "After everything he said, everything he showed, that wasn't a game, Marcus." He sighed and looked down. "I know, but I don't know what to do either, Helena. I can't prove any of this, and yet..." He fell silent. They both knew that the emptiness Elias had left behind weighed heavier than his visions. In the following days, no one spoke of it again. But at night, when the wind swept across the rooftops, Helena sometimes thought she heard a distant humming, barely audible, like an echo from afar. On December 30th, Elias wrote only one sentence in his small school notebook. "When the light is silent, one learns to listen." Helena found the sentence the next morning. Below it was a spiral, this time black, not gold. She asked him at breakfast, "Why did you write that?" "Because she said so before she left." "What else did she say?" "That the light remains only in those who do not cease to search." Helena looked at Marcus, but he said nothing. He just stared at the spiral as if it were a puzzle that frightened him. That night, Helena dreamed of a desert, infinitely vast, beneath a sky filled with shining points. She heard voices in the wind, soft, rhythmic, and then one, clear and bright. "Remember when it gets dark." In the morning, she found Elias already awake at the window. "Did you dream of the desert too, Mama?" he asked without turning around. She nodded, unable to speak. Elias smiled weakly. "She saw you. Now she knows that you believe." Then he turned away, picked up his figures, and began to play silently. Helena felt tears in her eyes, not from fear, but from the feeling that something sacred had been lost. The light was silent, but the silence sounded like a promise. The last day of the year arrived quietly, almost unnoticed. No more snow fell. Only a leaden sky hung over Munich. The Vogler family's apartment smelled of wax and cold tea. Helena sat at the kitchen table, a notebook in front of her, what she now called the Diary of Light. Since that December, she had written down every sentence, every word, every drawing her son had made, date by date, night after night. Not out of curiosity, but out of a feeling that these things had to be preserved. Elias was playing in the living room, quietly and intently. Marcus was reading a book, or at least pretending to, but both of them kept glancing at Helena, who was writing incessantly. The first page of her diary read, "On December 3rd, my son spoke of the star that didn't need a voice to be heard." Then followed notes in dense paragraphs. "Dreams of sand and wind." Words in a dead language. A spiral of light that appeared over Munich. Helena slowly turned the pages. On page 42, in shaky handwriting, it said, "The sun's path, The path the heart recognizes before the mind understands it. She briefly put down her pen and looked at Elias. He was building small hills out of modeling clay, placing figures on them. 3 men, a paper star above them. He didn't realize he was repeating something that lay dormant deep in his memory. "Elias," she said softly, "may I ask you something?" He nodded. "Why do you remember all of that?" He thought for a moment. "Because nobody tells the story anymore. When something is forgotten, it seeks someone to remember it." Helena smiled sadly. "And you are that someone." "I am just one ear," Elias said calmly. "She speaks through all who listen." Marcus put his book aside. "And what if she never speaks again?" Elias looked at him with that serious, ageless expression. "Then we must understand the silence." He stood up, went to the window, and looked up at the gray sky. "You'd think the star was up there, but that's not true. It was never there." Helena approached him and placed her hand on his shoulder. "Where was he then?" Elias looked at her and smiled slightly. "In those who are searching." A moment of perfect silence. Outside, the wind began to blow, sweeping across the rooftops, causing a bell to ring in the distance. Later, when Elias was asleep, Helena and Marcus sat side by side at the table. Together they read the last lines of her diary. Helena wrote slowly, as if she wanted to capture the unseen. Elias speaks like someone who has wandered through time. He remembers desserts, lights, voices. Perhaps his words are not proof, but memories that show us that the sacred does not disappear. It waits until someone listens again. She put down her pen, flipped back through the pages, looked at all the pages that were full of secrets, and whispered, "Perhaps this is not a diary about a child, but about what spoke through him." Marcus replied quietly, "And maybe we both heard it too." As she extinguished the candle, a final faint glow fell upon the book, a reflection of the light from outside. For a fleeting moment, the flame seemed to spiral, just like in her son's drawings. Helena saw it, smiled silently, and whispered, "The stars continue to speak, only quietly." And so the year 2023 ended, not with fireworks, but with a promise of light that remained in silence.